I guess without further ado, I would hand over to Micah Baker from Google to present KF to us.
Okay, great. I'm glad that we worked out which Zoom meeting to join. I had just a short presentation I was going to share on kind of our design approach for KF. If there's interest in like a demo or something, I'm comfortable doing that. But I didn't want this to be like a product pitch or anything. This is really about like the philosophy and some of our opinions on where we think things could go. So let me start with the presentation. All right, can I get a thumbs up on if that's showing up okay? Good, okay. So I just want to level set on this first, that this is just an opinion. There are lots of opinions, and we're just speaking from kind of our perspective of what our experience has been so far. But as we got into KF a couple of years ago, trying to figure out directionally, what is the right way to go once you are building off of Kubernetes, and we had to make a couple of important decisions. We realized that there were some aspects of VM-based Cloud Foundry that just can't directly translate over to Kubernetes. And there could be a big engineering effort to force it to fit, but we didn't think that the return on that would be very high. So we made some important design decisions of anything on the platform side and some things on the operations side are okay to break. I'll talk a little bit more about that as we move forward. But what we started off with is like trying to understand, what are we working with? Like what's great about Cloud Foundry? And so if you look at some of the key ingredients of Cloud Foundry, and certainly this is not an exhaustive list, but we put all the things in and boil it down. What we really cared about and what we appreciated the most is like that great developer experience, which translates into developer velocity and overall abstraction of the infrastructure is a big outcome for the application team. But when you think about how people describe Cloud Foundry, it really depends on who they are and what their role is within the ecosystem. And if you'll bear with me, I'm trying to modernize a very old parable here. We'll say that these are 5 people who are unaware of the larger picture, and they're experiencing different parts of something that's too big for them to understand as a whole. So when you think about the different personas or users of the Cloud Foundry stack, we can kind of think of them as kind of like Cloud Foundry as part of this elephant, if you will. And they'll interact with different parts of it. So for example, folks who work on the application team, the whole point is they shouldn't have to interact with the rest of the system. So they might be CLI driven, for example, where they're just using that magical CF push. But as you work up in more complex scenarios, having API access is critical. Certainly needs to be somebody who's keeping the lights on with the infrastructure and the orchestration with Bosch. So just have different teams interacting with different parts of this elephant. So that led us to our first epiphany here, which is that you can't lift the whole elephant. This is going to be too much work. So what we did is we considered Kubernetes a breaking change, and that's what I was mentioning earlier, that we had to make the trade-offs, and we said it's okay to break the platform experience because that's something that customers are going through a change on anyway, no matter what. Most customers are driving towards Kubernetes, and they're going to rework their systems for that. So accepting that that's already going to happen. And then the operators will also have to go through some amount of change if they're maintaining production applications, tooling for that changes as they move over to Kubernetes. It's possible for us to build a bridge for the operators as well, but that wasn't as high a priority as protecting application compatibility and the developer experience. So like that's kind of the stack ranking of our priorities. And by focusing on those outcomes, we've been able to reach a higher velocity on just the core features, the minimum viable product approach for KF. And we believe that Kubernetes is still young. It's going through significant change still. If we commit to formalizing too many things at the Kubernetes level, we'll probably regret that because it will still continue to move at this high velocity. But over time, it's pretty clear that a lot more things are showing up in the Kubernetes ecosystem that we cared about within the older, more mature Cloud Foundry ecosystem. So rather than trying to bring everything exactly the way it was over, we're seeing this as an opportunity to kind of reset and still start, go back to the basics of like what made Cloud Foundry desirable in the first place. It wasn't, developers didn't say, please give me something that runs on Bosch. Like the whole point was that they shouldn't have to care about that. And similarly, we don't think that they should say, please give me something that runs on Kubernetes. They shouldn't have to worry about that. But they should say, I care about having that cf push experience and the developer velocity and quality experience of abstraction. So the way that we were approaching this, where we think it would be better traction going forward, would be breaking up kind of the scope of moving to Kubernetes into tiers, because it's too much to try to reinvent the whole thing all at the same time, in our opinion. But if there was an approach of defining a CLI experience, where we're saying you could have your own implementation as necessary of an API to make a CLI experience work, but developers are used to these outcomes from the CLI, maybe defining a subset of CLI commands that would become a minimum core set of CLI options to say that you're delivering the Cloud Foundry light or minimal experience. But then obviously there are reasons to grow beyond that. Certainly for automation purposes, API becomes very important. And eventually vendors would probably care about having like their own full stack similar to what we have in more of the legacy Cloud Foundry experience. So this was a way for me to try to quickly communicate our philosophy on how we designed KF and the trade-offs that we felt comfortable making. We feel good about those decisions. There are no regrets about optimizing for the developer and application experience. It seems like the API would be something that is possible if there's a more formal approach to like what would a Cloud Foundry API look like abstracted from the infrastructure, right? So like if we're able to say there's a standard approach that we want to use that's not necessarily trying to bring over everything that used to be in the previous stack, an opportunity to be Kubernetes native, more declarative on the API side, but then support more of the imperative workflows on the CLI side. I think that would be a summary of how we think that could come together in the future. So I didn't want to do like a super long presentation, but I think this would be a good place to ask questions if you want any more information.
One of my first questions would be like, I think KF started as an open source project. It was moved to be a closed source project. Are there any plans to change that again?
We've left the door open for bringing in open source in the future. There hasn't been demand for that. I think the demand has been getting applications running on Kubernetes as soon as possible. And by bringing it in-house, we were able to move very fast. And there's still been significant discussion in the open source community about approaches. And we just wanted to be able to get something working and deliver solutions as soon as possible. But that's something like if there is demand for that, or more of this kind of formal approach to how to move forward on Kubernetes in kind of stages, so that it's more kind of more feasible engineering efforts, scoped outcomes, versus just saying we need to deliver the entire previous experience. Then I think that would make it easier for us to fit in again.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I would still love to see like the current state of KF, because I think like my experience goes back to like the days when it still was open source. Didn't really like have a chance to look at like how it evolved. On the other hand, Micah, you said that like the trade-off that you made for the developer is that like they shouldn't actually care about is the underlying provisioning done based on BOSH, or is it a Kubernetes system that is actually running these workloads? So how is like the feedback of your users regarding that, or how strong is like the desire to kind of have the Cloud Foundry workflow, but still be able to mix and match it with like other things from the Kubernetes ecosystem? Mm-hmm. Because that's like one discussion that I have been hearing quite frequently.
Yeah, let me try sharing a tab here. So maybe a quick way to demonstrate, like if I'm just using the KF CLI and I can list my spaces, right? I don't have to know about the underlying Kubernetes resources being used, but if I wanted to, I could actually look at from a Kubernetes perspective and see the namespaces, and I'll find that those same spaces exist as namespaces. So there's kind of an opportunity to break the glass and get closer to the Kubernetes side if you want to, but from the CLI experience, you very rarely get exposed to anything Kubernetes related. I think the biggest thing would be you need to target a cluster to say, I'm going to interact with this cluster. And so that would be getting the credentials for that cluster. And once you have that, then all of your commands can be done through the KF CLI. So
maybe a follow-up question regarding that, because we've been discussing that topic also quite frequently here in this round, which is like, of course you can now show the namespaces, but like, are you also opening them up and even encouraging users to go into the namespaces and like manipulate the objects that are stored in there? Or are you saying this is like just a read-only view on like the underlying infrastructure, but like don't modify it that way?
Yeah, like I have the ability to see those namespaces because I'm the cluster admin. An actual application team would not see all those things. Like they would see what RBAC has said they're allowed to see. And there are also space manager, space developer, and space auditor roles defined within KF that we can scope our users within on top of the Kubernetes RBAC.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I think another, going back to like the architectural and design decisions, we also collapsed spaces and orgs into spaces. For the most part, that would be a quick way of explaining it. Orgs end up being handled through like the project that the cluster is running in. So if you want to track billing and chargebacks, you have cluster granularity. You can also have namespace granularity. So in order to reduce complexity and also not try to reinvent things that Kubernetes is already solving for, we just said like namespace is kind of our unit that we stop at, and then after that Kubernetes is and whatever the provider is offering is used. But things like service broker, are implemented. So like if a customer had their own service brokers, were API compliant with the open service broker specification, I think 2.1. So we have Cloud Service Broker for KF. We distribute that ourselves. We also have recently introduced NFS, and we just provision the persistent volume claims for the user. So all you have to do is tell us the path to your NFS server, and then we'll just make that happen. Lots of opportunities like that. For example, these services, like a developer needs to be able to quickly self-serve, get access to something, but all the different vendors out there have different and more polished ways of offering vetted solutions within an organization. So we see this as an opportunity to not try to reinvent the wheel there. There's already a way within the Kubernetes ecosystem to advertise services, to centralize all the different services. And when you think about coming from Bosch over to Kubernetes, would customers want a Snowflake marketplace? Would they want, I have my overall Kubernetes strategy and how it manages services, and then Cloud Foundry has its own marketplace that's separate from that. I think that there's opportunity to converge on like a universal catalog concept for customers, so that if they have workloads that are outside of Cloud Foundry, then they still have the ability to self-serve and publish all the different workflows, but they're not managing two separate systems.
And the like marketplace on the Kubernetes side, this is not service catalog, right?
Right. Well, yeah. So like that's one of the ways that you can offer a catalog of services.
Right.
So I mean, like at Google, we have our own market, like the GCP marketplace is an example. Like most vendors have a marketplace concept. We also have private catalog, which is more akin, I think private catalog is more akin to the marketplace within Cloud Foundry, where you say a platform team has published solutions that meet their requirements, and those are solutions that are available for end users to self-serve. So that would be an example of two places to do the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I again, like I don't feel comfortable doing like a whole bunch of demos. I can give pretty good explanations of things, but I really don't want to feel like I'm selling KF or something like that. I really want to focus on that bigger picture. And I've been kind of lurking for months, watching the different discussions within the community on the vision for going forward, trying to get a sense of where the consensus is kind of landing. And I see a lot of positive things in the design or the vision document. I think my biggest concern is how big of a lift it is to do all of it. And that's why I think scoping it into, like, you're starting over. And what's an MVP of Cloud Foundry? If you were to go back in time to when Cloud Foundry first got created, and there was like this vision of like, we need to make a great developer experience. And at the time, infrastructure was very different. And so decisions were made based on what was true at the time. But if you were to do that again now, and Kubernetes is kind of like your starting point for infrastructure, it'd be different from the implementation on the back end. Do you need to own the entire stack anymore? I think Kubernetes has redefined that. Like the extensible API system within Kubernetes is really well suited for this kind of approach, where you can have a front-end experience on a cluster or a set of clusters, and just leverage that extensibility rather than trying to create our own, again, just because we used to.
Okay, further questions from the round? I don't want to be like
yeah, don't be shy.
Micah, you mentioned this kind of duality between the KF commands and then that a developer could run to manipulate those resources, and then the corresponding Kubernetes representations that you could even access through kubectl and with permissions restricted by k8s or some other policy. I was wondering if you might be able to go into detail about like some of those backing resources, and if there are any decisions that you made around like which ones to present that have continuity with existing CF objects versus which ones you thought might be more appropriate to hide or to defer exposing.
So specific Kubernetes resources that are visible or made visible intentionally to like a developer persona?
Yeah, or even like, within that space that is kind of part of the KF domain model. There's the Appcentric resources. I was wondering if you had any thoughts or philosophy to convey about like structuring those and the relationships between them, and how they relate to the existing CF entities that are, say, exposed through the API or CF CLI.
Yeah, I think what I could say on that is we worked backwards from the CLI experience and not forwards from the API experience. So we're building things Kubernetes idiomatic to support the outcomes that we wanted on the CLI. And we also are keeping the options open. As I mentioned, like Kubernetes is evolving very quickly. If you're developing Kubernetes, you know that 1.22 has some pretty significant breaking changes that people have been aware about for a while, but they're going to land. We want to make sure that we're flexible on that implementation. And so not rushing to formalize, I think, has been another philosophy. So we can continue to optimize the resource model without breaking anyone, because we haven't yet directly exposed those resources through a formalized API. We're still consuming that ourselves, but we're kind of at that point where we're ready to graduate some of our API designs into something formal. For example, being able to manage spaces through GitOps is desirable. So having a formal way for customers to know, as a platform team, you're already using something like GitOps to manage in Kubernetes clusters. Wouldn't it be great if you could say, I want these spaces to always exist on all my KF clusters, and you can just put that in the same Git repo as all your other configuration for clusters, and then KF will honor that and create those spaces. And how do you want those spaces configured? That could be in the spec for the resource, and then maybe lock down the CLI. Like spaces are managed fully via GitOps, and so the CLI is not allowed to manage spaces because that's a platform decision that was made. We still have a lot of flexibility because we haven't locked down that backend design, and we're still in kind of learning quickly from feedback and our own experiences. But we feel pretty good about the front end experience, and I think understanding like how many CF CLI options are still relevant in a Kubernetes world is like a whole nother discussion. There's definitely a core set of CLI commands that almost every customer uses. Like, CF push is for sure going to be used, and routes, there may be self-service in use, so marketplace may be used, but there is kind of a bar you could set of after this, it's diminishing returns on adding this new complexity. Very few customers may be using certain CF CLI options. So we're not starting with like, just take whatever was there and bring it over. We're also vetting those CLI options to reduce complexity and challenge ourselves to say, is it necessary in the Kubernetes world? Is there an alternative way? Is this CF CLI option only there because it was a way to configure the infrastructure, in which case we'd say, well, GitOps would be better than an imperative approach. So declarative platform, imperative front end reduces the amount of options we have to worry about. If it's okay, I would like to ask a question too. Not about KF, but in general, like there's a lot of recent change within the community, and just understanding where the interest is in the cf-for-k8s vision. Is that still kind of the plan of record, that the vision document? I'd like to understand, are there kind of concrete next steps that are already envisioned to start getting into execution? Because I worry that it'll be like Python 2 to Python 3, and it will be a very long process because it's too big to scope and resource against. So that's one of the reasons why I'm thinking about these bite-sized changes, where some amount of engineering effort is required, but it's easily understood and people can jump in and start making that happen. And it's work that is incrementally towards the larger goal, but it feels like a lot of scope right now, just like trying to solve all of the problems at once.
Yeah, I think I can speak to some of that. I think we've still been taking that document as guidance about how to proceed in the community. And more recently, there's been a certain amount of technical exploration and validation of some approaches over the past few months. But I feel like that's been coming together in support of, along the lines of, Micah, what you've said around those developer-facing resources, having that as that initial scope of work to support. So again, kind of the thinking a little bit more strongly about compatibility with the existing CF CLI and API, but that subset of commands and resources that are relevant to support those developer-facing operations within a space. So I think that hasn't maybe been as explicitly documented or formulated in like a single proposal document, but that's been the direction that the development in the past few months has been headed in the community, and certainly that's been the interest and priority for a lot of the VMware folks that have been contributing. So I can certainly speak to them from a vendor standpoint. And I know we've had several folks from SAP as well contributing, both to some of the details with the Irene component in terms of that level translation, but I think also thinking about how best to integrate the CF CLI with Kubernetes authentication and authorization, and then thinking also about some of those like continuity with those higher level or broader tenancy constructs. Like, what would it mean to, like, we're still, at least for the developer perspective, presenting a notion of an organization, just because that's still on that critical path for logging in and getting to CF push. But what would that really look like underneath in the lightest weight, a lightweight implementation to support that?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges is how to have a reference architecture as well as support the kind of flexibility that I was describing. Like these days, like almost any major vendor in the public cloud space has a multi-cloud product. And that was kind of the original intention of like Cloud Foundry, was like giving you a stack that you can run in all these different places. That problem's getting solved in so many different ways now with Kubernetes as the common infrastructure across all these different providers, whether it's on-prem or public clouds. So on the one hand, it makes sense to not try to solve that problem because it's being very well solved and commercialized, and that has a very long future ahead of it. Very clearly, it's just the multi-cloud and hybrid cloud space. But then how, in the open source side of things, how can you have like the Cloud Foundry experience that you can go and try out and understand it while still saying, if you want to go to a commercial Cloud Foundry supported experience, you're not going to have the same back end as what the reference implementation will have. Like it could be radically different, but the outcome needs to be the same. Like I'm able to interact with that system as a developer, and I don't have to know about where my clusters are running or even that I have a cluster. I just have a space, starting from that. I think that's a challenge of how can you have your cake and eat it too. I think the vendors are solving this one problem, but it doesn't solve it necessarily in the open source space.
I think on that front, that there has been obviously discussions around like the prior certification of Cloud Foundry, which essentially prescribed that you had to have a certain like core set of components in a fairly recent version. And I think, Micah, what you're speaking to and what we've also discussed when creating that vision document is rather some kind of API level specification of the system and how it behaves, as opposed to kind of prescribing certain implementations that achieve that behavior ultimately.
Mm. Yeah, I guess it's a exponentially more complex project as you get into the engineering effort and you worry about boxing yourself in or taking the wrong opinion. So it's like, oh, I saw we should support service meshes, but somebody might not want to use Istio, and so we have to design it so that it can work. Each time you hit one of those decisions and you're like, we have to make it work for everything, the lift got heavier. Like every time you can take an opinion and say, yes, there are other ways to do it, but this is the way we're going to do it, then you have your scope really clearly defined and it's more achievable on timelines. So I think maybe another piece of feedback would be, don't be afraid for reference implementation, like find something that works, make those opinions and say like, yeah, there are other ways of doing it. There are other, like pick a service mesh, but we needed to pick this one because it was the one that fit best in our timeline and our outcomes. And, if you want to help us support more meshes, then jump into the project. But the priority should be getting a working reference architecture and then go back and add the complexity of lots of choices. This is a common, I think, engineering pitfall is we're too smart and we're like, well, I would want the choices, but most of the end users of our types of products, they wish that there were less choices. They want it to just work, and then they'll have opinions after they experience it, and they'll be like, oh, now I wish it was something else. It's kind of like a natural process, but until they have an opinion to react to, it's the old, the Henry Ford automobile conversation. If you ask people what they want a faster horse. Until they actually had the car, then they're like, oh, well, now I want different colors and I want different features. I think that's kind of a normal customer process of understanding designs.
Yeah, I think definitely. We've also been certainly looking at what was appealing and what worked about cf-for-k8s and what continued to be impediments there. And I think there was still that tension there around like it was pretty complete system in terms of like that could be deployed on top of Kubernetes. But I think with some of the integrations that it pulled in ended up being a little heavier weight or less flexible than was appealing to some folks as well. certainly like pulling in Istio from the get-go required a lot of technical complexity and management. And so I think with the current approach, especially with that focus on like really scoping to preserving that developer experience, but letting other things, as you said, be up for not being re-implemented or having breaking changes in general, from mid-administrator things on down through the stack. That's giving more latitude to have even like a lighter weight and more accessible reference deployment in the community. So certainly that's what I think. There's been a lot of discussion around that, even with within the current tracks of work. Like, okay, what are those right smaller set of capabilities and interfaces to focus on for right now, just so we can get that core up and running end to end with some of those choices, and then we can go back through and realize incrementally the modularity of that statement in the mission document over time. But getting the core working and functional and solid while preserving that developer experience has been the approach that I think the current tracks of development have been pursuing for sure.
Okay, any more questions from the round or feedback?
I'm also in the Slack channel, Cloud Foundry cf-for-k8s. Also, like, I guess I'm just in general in the Cloud Foundry Slack. So you're welcome to ping any questions in either the shared group, or if you want to direct message me, that's fine too. But I appreciate the invitation to kind of share our learnings. I wanted to be very careful not to come across as like we have like the only opinion or the correct opinion or something. This is just our journey, and certainly there are many paths to get there. And so hopefully was diplomatic and not, I didn't want to make anyone feel like we're criticizing any previous efforts.
No, I think very well done.
Oh, I certainly appreciate you stopping in and sharing your perspective and philosophy to date. So it's really great to see. Thank you.
Cool. Unless there's any last minute questions, I think we can close for now. Thank you very much again, Micah, for sharing your perspective, Google's perspective on the topic, and hope to see you and also obviously the others in one of the next calls in this round. Yeah, thank you very much.
I'd love to hear more of these kinds of discussions too, like real experiences of like design decisions and see if there are themes of what's working best. I think that's useful.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Then, thank you very much, everybody, and talk to you soon.
All right.
Have a great day.
Thanks.
Bye.
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 Bye-bye.